Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, April 6th, 2022, and today we are going to be taking a look at polls out of the state of Georgia and North Carolina that provide us an interesting understanding of where these states are expected to go in the upcoming 2022 Senate and governor elections. Now, these two states are extremely crucial for the balance of power when it comes down to both the United States Senate and ultimately who will be in power in the next governor election from the state of Georgia. These races are going to be extremely contested. In fact, they already are. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, struggling to field extremely strong candidates and possibly, will be in a position where you have some major contenders in every single one of these three races on both sides, meaning 6 top-tier candidates. In the Georgia Senate election, it looks very much like it's going to be Raphael Warnock and who do you have? Walker here. I think this is also going to be a very interesting case between, who can actually win. Someone who is Trump endorsed, someone who is the more celebrity figure, a football player who was, well known across the state of Georgia, or someone who was able to defeat a Republican during 2021 when Biden was riding high. Different circumstances in terms of our national environment, but it will be a very interesting case to see whether or not Trump's effect will actually be detrimental to a potential Republican nominee, in this case, Herschel Walker, who is very much the presumptive GOP nominee, or whether or not, Raphael Warnock will be able to counteract the red wave type of year that 2022 is expected to be. So a lot to see there. When it comes down to the Georgia governor election, we pretty much know it's going to be Stacey Abrams on the Democratic side. We really don't see anyone entertaining the possibility of another Democrat, and I do not believe she has any type of major or even minor Democratic opponent in the governor election. That one's pretty much locked up. But in terms of the Republican side, you have Brian Kemp and David Perdue. David Perdue was the senator, former CEO of Dollar General, won his election back in 2014, lost in 2021. What you're finding is that, he is now running for governor because he believes that Brian Kemp is not right-wing enough. Donald Trump has endorsed David Perdue. We will see what happens in that primary. Brian Kemp, however, is the incumbent governor. So because we don't know exactly who the nominee is going to be, it's going to be an interesting race. In the Senate race for North Carolina, the Democrats are locked up behind Sherry Beasley. She's the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. She actually almost won re-election back in 2020. Not necessarily saying she was elected before. Actually, she was an appointed position, but she actually only lost by less than, I think, a quarter percentage point. So it was an extremely close race, but ultimately she ended up coming up short. But now she is running for Senate, and the field has been cleared for her. On the Republican side, however, you have Ted Budd and Pat McCrory. Pat McCrory being the former governor of the state, and Ted Budd being a representative who's been endorsed by President Trump. However, if you take a look at the primary data here, there is still a possibility that Pat McCrory could end up ahead, but Ted Budd being someone who started out with single digits in the overall polling data, not even polling anywhere near defeating the rest of these candidates, ultimately what you're finding is that now he is in the lead, largely in part due to President Trump's endorsement. So overall, what we are going to take away from these videos, from the topic of today's video, is pretty much looking at where these polls fit into our 2022 understanding. To do a little bit of a flashback, in 2016, the Republican Party won both the Senate election in Georgia and also North Carolina. Now, David Perdue, like I mentioned, was the senator. His election was actually not in 2016. So his Senate seat is solidified in favor of the Democratic Party until 2026, and chances are he's not going to run for that again, which is why he has now pivoted to the governor election. But the election that is now up is the one held by Raphael Warnock. Now, Johnny Isakson won in 2016. If you're wondering how Warnock ended up in the United States Senate, you have to understand Johnny Isakson was a very old senator. He ran despite some type of calls from members of his own political party and members of the Democratic Party saying that he needed to retire. Instead, he decided to run again. But then he removed himself from the Senate, saying, citing health issues, saying that he wanted to be, not necessarily in the United States Senate at this point in time because he didn't believe that he could serve to his fullest capability. With his resignation, a special election was triggered and the Democratic Party was able to win it. Had he not won in 2016, or had he not ran in 2016, chances are that the Democratic Party would not have control of the United States Senate today because of the circumstances that led to the Democratic Party's victory. So, taking a look at the state of Georgia, it's an interesting case because in 2016, it went to the Republicans by 13 points. 4 years later, you saw the Democrats win here by just over 2 points in the state in the runoff election. So, actually about 4 years and 2 months from this actual election date. But it's interesting to see. 2018 was also a year in which the Republicans won in the state of Georgia, and this was the governor election. Now, arguably, Georgia is bluer now than it was in the past, but the national environment isn't conducive to Democratic victories like it was in 2018 or even 2020. But what we find here is that even though 2018 was a blue wave, Brian Kemp was still able to win. But the interesting thing about this now is that if he is potentially primaried, the polls show that David Perdue is actually a weaker candidate. Even though Perdue, 4 years prior to this election, won by 7 points statewide, what you found is that Brian Kemp actually outperforms him in the general election. Again, we'll talk about why that might be, what the Trump effect might be on this overall race, and it should be very interesting to explore further throughout this video. And in the 2020 election, what you are going to find is that Georgia flipped blue for the first time since 1992. Joe Biden won here, and it pretty much set up the state to be competitive for the next decade and potentially a Democratic stronghold in the future. It has gotten consistently more and more left-wing. If you take a look at the trend over time, you will find that in the comparison here, you will see that relative to the beginning of the 21st century, you will see that Georgia has consistently shifted to the left, consistently until now, relative to where it was at the beginning of the 21st century till now, it's 12 points more Democratic. 10 years down the line, it could be 6 points more Democratic, and eventually it becomes a likely state, a safe state, and then it's solidified for the Democratic Party. So overall, what we know so far is that Georgia has had Republican victories in the past, but more recently has been okay with electing Democrats. But the polls don't exactly tell us that in this individual state. They have polls out of the Republican primary in the Republican side for, that's redundant, the Republican primary polls for the Georgia governor's race. And what you are finding is that Brian Kemp wins by about 11 points. Now, this is actually very similar to every single poll that we have seen. At a different period of time, back in December, immediately following the announcement of David Perdue's campaign with Trump's endorsement, you saw a tie between Brian Kemp and David Perdue. But since then, Brian Kemp has begun to expand his lead. 7 points, 9 points, 9 points, then a consistent 11 points, bringing us to an average of Brian Kemp being up 9.4%. However, I will say that President Trump's endorsement means a lot, specifically in the state of Georgia, and Brian Kemp can tell you that more than anyone. In 2018, Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State running against the Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle. Cagle was very much the frontrunner. People saw him as the presumptive Republican nominee for a brief period of time, but Brian Kemp still put up a good fight. The first round of the primary went and, was finalized. Casey Cagle came ahead of Brian Kemp by over 100,000 votes, and what you found is that they were headed off to a runoff. Casey Cagle was at about 38%, Brian Kemp was at about 25%. And what you found is that when President Trump endorsed Brian Kemp, in that runoff election months later, Casey Cagle was obliterated. Not only did he lose to Brian Kemp by a significant margin, I think you're talking about over 30 points between the two, Casey Cagle received less votes in the runoff primary than he did in the first one, whereas Brian Kemp expanded by hundreds of thousands of votes. And that happened because of President Trump's endorsement, because the effect of it was strong, because Brian Kemp had Donald Trump and Mike Pence down there campaigning with him, and thus Brian Kemp was selected as the Republican nominee for governor and then went on to win the general election. The same thing could happen here with David Perdue. Though the polling numbers do show Brian Kemp ahead by 11 points, there is nothing saying that President Trump won't make a few last-minute efforts right before the month of May, potentially this month or next month, to campaign for David Perdue and drastically drive up his numbers. It will be very interesting to see, and I honestly think that could be in Brian Kemp's reality, which is why it's good for him right now to expand this lead, but it could very much be crunched within a day or two, depending on how Donald Trump strategically plays this primary. But in the general election, what we are finding is that Brian Kemp and David Perdue both defeat Stacey Abrams. And I think that makes sense for right now. When you take a look at the overall numbers for Joe Biden and the generic ballot, personally, I'm not impressed where the Democratic Party is right now, and I don't think many people are. If you take a look at the expectations when it comes down to the governor elections, you will find that Georgia is very much expected to go red. On the Senate level, I've said consistently that Georgia is going red. The last time I had it in the Democratic column was all the way back in August of 2021. So keeping that in mind, you see that Georgia is a state where it could go back and forth, but for right now, the Republican Party has pretty much been maintaining their lead for quite some time. The governor election is no different. The last time I had Georgia as a blue state on the governor level was all the way back in August of 2021. So right about the time period in which you saw significant crises happen in Afghanistan that resulted in Joe Biden being disapproved of, and that has continued up until now. So Georgia is very much a state that we expect to be red, but looking at Brian Kemp and David Perdue against Stacey Abrams, one thing is evident, and it has been pretty consistently in polling data from the state of Georgia, that David Perdue underperforms Brian Kemp. And I think this comes in contact with Herschel Walker, only defeating Raphael Warnock by 4 points. Republican victories are Republican victories. I'm not at all trying to diminish the advantage or the ability that the Republican Party does right now have in terms of defeating the Democratic Party, but what I am trying to show you and trying to showcase is that there is an underperformance relative to the more traditional, more conservative candidates like Brian Kemp. There is no reason why voters should be more apprehensive about voting for Walker or Perdue than they are if you're voting for Kemp. Kemp has been the incumbent that was in a contested race 4 years ago. He only won by about 2 percentage points. When you see that happening, less than 2, by the way. When you see that happening, what you are finding is that there is a common denominator between Walker and Perdue that isn't shared with Brian Kemp in this election, and that is the involvement, direct involvement, and endorsement of President Trump. I also think the incumbency factor could be potentially benefiting Warnock and benefiting Kemp, but at the same time, I will say I find it hard to believe that there are voters out there that are backing Kemp and Perdue over Abrams that are backing Warnock. I think what you are finding is more so people pushing back against Republican nominees rather than their excitement or their willingness to support a Democrat in this election. And I think a lot of that comes down to President Trump being viewed as a negative figure in the state of Georgia. And when you have people like Brian Kemp who have been shaken by no one else than Donald Trump, Brian Kemp would still very much like to be associated with him. It seems to be actually helping him electorally, and I think there could be something behind that. But at the end of the day, Republicans are defeating the Democrats in all 3 of these polls. Generally speaking, they shouldn't be too worried, but I will say that if it comes down to a very close margin, let's say if the things get exceptionally close, it could make all the difference between a Trump-endorsed, Trump-backed GOP primary candidate versus one who was sort of ostracized by President Trump and pushed out there as an outsider. At the end of the day, when Trump voters are forced to make a decision between between a Republican and a Democrat, they are going to be a Republican. I think that's going to be the outcome, no matter what. Even if they don't necessarily like Brian Kemp, I can guarantee you they're voting for him over Stacey Abrams every single time. And moving down to North Carolina, let's go ahead and pivot to a state that's neighboring to the state of Georgia. You have a Senate election that is expected to be somewhat competitive. Now, I have been very clear as well that I expect the Senate election to go to the GOP. In fact, never once had I ever thought the Democrats were going to win. At some point, I had it as tilt red, meaning that it was going to be a little bit closer. At other points, I had it as likely red, and I kept that characterization for a pretty consistent period of time. For right now, I'm going to keep it as lean red. I think that's really where it stands, but ultimately, we're seeing 2 drastically different numbers. Ted Budd is ahead by 7, but Pat McCrory is ahead by 2. Down by 2. In terms of the Republican primary, Ted Budd is ahead by 16 points. My bet is on that Ted Budd ends up winning this race, but if the primary clears and people such as Mark Walker, who could potentially resent Ted Budd for taking the Trump endorsement from him, might endorse Pat McCrory, and that could potentially boost up his numbers. Ted Budd is the Trump-endorsed candidate, and you can't really shake that. That is something that Ted Budd has in terms of an advantage, and he's going to use that effectively. And seems like he has been, considering that he went at one point in polls from being 4%, now at 38%, defeating the former governor in the Republican primary. But when it comes down to the general election, we're actually seeing a bit of an opposite thing happen when it comes down from what we see in the state of Georgia. Ted Budd, being the Trump-endorsed candidate, defeats Sherry Beasley by 7 points. But in terms of the Senate election between Pat McCrory and Sherry Beasley, the Democrat, ends up winning by 2. This is where it gets interesting. I will say that I am a bit cautious to consider these things to be very similar. I will say Pat McCrory is probably a less popular figure than Ted Budd when it comes down to statewide recognition. The difference between Brian Kemp and David Perdue may be that Perdue won in 2018, that Perdue lost in 2021, but Kemp won in 2018. I will say, though, that both of them are relatively unpopular. I don't think Kemp is exactly this, Ron DeSantis type figure for the state of Georgia. I don't think Ted Budd is either, but Pat McCrory lost in 2016 for a reason, right? When Roy Cooper defeated Pat McCrory on the same ballot that Donald Trump won the state of North Carolina by 3 points, there was something interesting going on, and that victory then led to Roy Cooper winning by 5 points statewide. Pat McCrory was voted out for a reason. People didn't like his performance as governor. It was just simply unpopular. At least for David Perdue, Democrats won the state of Georgia, so there was no real expectation for him to win the Senate election. But when you take a look at the general election, it is very clear that voters in the state of North Carolina are not super inclined to vote for Pat McCrory, especially after rejecting him in 2016. That means definitively there were voters out there that voted for President Trump or a third-party candidate that backed Roy Cooper in the general election. And I can tell you now that there were certainly voters, considering that Trump won North Carolina but Roy Cooper won by 5 points, 6% of voters that voted for the Republican Party that then voted for the Democrats. I think it's interesting to see But when you take a look at the North Carolina Senate race here, the divide seems to be evident. The dislike and disdain for Pat McCrory seems to be clear as day. For him to be losing by 2 against a Democrat that another Republican is defeating by 7 amongst the same sample, the same groups, the same demographics, something needs to be going off in the Republican Party's head saying, hey, Ted Budd is the right way to go. And I think that's going to ultimately lead into a Republican Party victory. I've been very clear about how I stand about North Carolina and Georgia since after August of 2021. And I think it is getting increasingly more clear that there is a pushback on Biden. There is a pushback on the Democratic Party, and it's not just hearsay. The Republican Party is up in polls in Georgia, the Georgia Senate race, the governor race, in addition to the North Carolina Senate race. And I think what we are going to find is that Republicans are going to win here. Depending on who the nominees are, the races could get a little bit closer or potentially more favored for the Democratic Party. But at the end of the day, I would say that any of these Republicans running more than likely would defeat the Democratic Party in the general election simply because of our national environment and where these states stand relative to Joe Biden's performance and the generic ballot. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen is a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.